week of 2023 and the start of another huge week of opposition to France's pensions plans here. Now, the anger really erupting onto the streets last Thursday for the biggest day of strikes for years here in France after the government used special legislation to push through the plans. Tomorrow is another major day of strike action here then, with all the unions calling for what will be a 10th major strike day here this year. We're going to talk about the latest and as well about how it's all being viewed from abroad with Richard Worley, who's France correspondent for the Swiss newspaper Blick. He's also author of La France contre elle-même, or France Against Itself, which looks at the fractures here in France. Thanks very much for being with us as ever, Richard. I mean, fractures here, certainly there have been fractures over pension reform, haven't you? I mean, where do you see this now? The government's really sticking to its guns and saying it's not going to withdraw this legislation, but the unions are still pushing in the other direction, aren't they?
True. What we are starting to see clearly is the strategy of the government. On the one hand, Emmanuel Macron is sticking to its reform, which is now in the hands of the Constitutional Court. The judge of the Constitutional Court have to render their verdict, I believe, before April 21st. On the other hand, the Prime Minister, Elisabeth Borne, is starting to consult around with potential social partners, with also different political parties, to see how she could extend her majority in Parliament. She just promised this Monday or yesterday that she will not use this famous Article 49.3 again, except for budgetary procedures. That is the strategy of the government. We may say government is buying time. On the other hand, for the trade unions, it's not that clear. Officially, they are still asking for the pause mode to put this pension reform on pause. What will they do if the government continues to refuse? There will be this day of protest on Tuesday with the risk of increased violence. Will they go for another day of protest the same week? Will they already start, let's say, a timetable of protest until the decision of the Constitutional Court? On their side, I would say it's not yet clear, but we'll see clearly tomorrow, more clearly tomorrow.
OK, well, let's talk about those two individually. Let's talk about the government side, first of all. Elisabeth Borne is meeting today, isn't she, with members of the majority. I mean, do you think there are any kind of concessions on the card? There was a bit of a concession, wasn't there, last week from Emmanuel Macron when he was talking in fond words, if that's the right way, with the leader of the CFDT, one of the big unions?
Well, to make it clear, on the social front, the only concession that the trade unions are ready to accept at the moment would be putting the pension reform on pause. That is the only thing that they will make us stopping to call for protest and so on. Politically, that's different. Politically, what Elisabeth Borne might try is to make some move. Either she could change her government, first possibility, bring in new personality, maybe personality from the civil society, as we say. Second thing she could do is convince Emmanuel Macron, for example, to dissolve parliament. I don't think that's the mood, but it could come. And third thing is to push for the referendum. There is a procedure at the moment in France, which has been starting by the left, to have what they call in France référendum d'initiative partagée. But that means you need to gather around 4 million signatures of French people to support that referendum. Maybe Elisabeth Borne will push into that direction. So to me, she will look at and she will explore political solution, while on the social front there is only one thing that can change the game. It is the pause mode for the pension reform.
And from the union's point of view, the crucial thing for them is the turnout tomorrow, isn't it? Because It was very high on Thursday. If it starts to dip or dips a lot, because let's face it, people are taking days off work and losing money.
True.
That's going to be crucial and a good sign for the Macron government.
You're very right. Knowing that the trade unions are in a kind of contradiction. Again, sorry, but France is the country of contradiction. On the one hand, they need to gather as many people as they can, and if possible, more than last Thursday. On the other hand, they have to be careful of the increased violence, because if violence erupts again in the street of Paris, Marseille, Lyon, Rennes, or wherever, they will be held accountable. But, in France, France very well. It's sad to say, but violence often pays off. When violence is there in the street, government backs off. So in the meantime, the trade unions are afraid of the violence, but they might use the violence to force the government to withdraw. So it's not an easy game politically to play for them.
How do you think this is being seen abroad, Richard? I was out of France for a lot of last week, actually. I haven't been here. You obviously work for a Swiss newspaper.
Yes.
How are the Swiss seeing it, and how are other nations, do you think, seeing it?
Well, when you see it from abroad, you see three things that are not that clearly explained in France. First thing is why Emmanuel Macron is pushing for this pension reform now. In France, he talks about structural reform, the need to put back on track the social system. Viewed from abroad, it's clearly public finance. You need to bring public finance in order, and the pension reform is a symbol of that, putting back on track the public finance. First thing. Second thing is that Emmanuel Macron is, I would say, quite solitary in the exercise of power. That's also what is striking from abroad. He is a very lonely president. He doesn't have this political apparatus. You remember, Nicolas Sarkozy was also despised 15 years ago, but he had a strong political apparatus. He had a strong majority. Emmanuel Macron is weak. That's the second thing. And third thing, I would say the international standing in France, European standing for Emmanuel Macron, though you can see there are strikes also in Germany. So in a way, Emmanuel Macron is not the only one confronted at the moment to social unrest and social difficulties because of inflation, because of the difficulty people have to make their ends meet.
And looking at France, what you were saying there about I know France well, you know France well as well, there is a bit of a perspective, and it's true, isn't there? There is a demonstration on a French street every single day, particularly the weekend. But France is very used to having and holding demonstrations. This is different, though, isn't it?
It's different for two reasons. First, and again, I forgot to mention that the other striking thing viewed from abroad is the photo opportunity of the being in Paris, all over Paris. When you see dirty Paris all over the world, Paris supposedly the city of light, becoming the city of darkness and of being everywhere in the streets. So media-wise, the effect for France is really bad, image-wise. Secondly, as far as the protests are concerned, I see what is striking viewed from abroad is the violence of the police. We are not surprised to see French people in the streets. We may even, from other countries, congratulate those French for fighting while in other countries people tend to accept everything. If you ask the tourists in Paris, many of them will say, oh, the French are fighting for the pension, that's good because in our country, in Italy, in the UK, we're not fighting enough. Now the question is violence. Where does it lead? And people are afraid of political violence in France because very often it flares up. We see the police being now accused of using too much violence power, and that can lead to difficult times.
Good to talk to you as ever. Thanks very much for coming in today. Richard Worley from the Swiss newspaper Blick, who's the French